All right, Rabbosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Adar Beis, the Schwarzbaum family in memory of Rabbi Aaron Schwarzbaum, Aharon Yosef ben Meir, Leah Sol, in the zechus of her daughter Ilana bas Esther's successful surgery and complete refuah sheleima for the safe return of our hostages and for the hatzlacha of our soldiers. Maia Hoffman, in memory of her father Reuven ben Emanuel, and in the merit of the hatzlacha, health and joy for her entire family. And Yoel Sara Kelman, in honor of the birth of their son, and in memory of Staff Sergeant David Sasson, Hashem Yikom Damo. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, all of the neshama have an aliyah, the families in neshama, and in merit Hashem, all the cholim shev refuah together with kol cholei Yisrael. But with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. And as always, never enough time. So today's daf is Chaf Beis, but we have a lot to do still on Chaf Aleph and Beis. So today's daf is 22. We are starting on 21b, and we are starting 18 lines down from the bottom. Tashma ma'os mifuzaros. So we'll say again, if you remember, so we were dealing with the fascinating machlokes Abaye and Rava regarding Yeyosh Shalomidas, namely, Reuven loses an object, but he is not aware yet that he has lost the object. It is the kind of object that upon becoming aware of the loss, he will definitely experience Yeyosh. So the sheleima now becomes, I find the object before Reuven even knows that he lost it. Am I allowed to keep the object now, before Yeyosh has occurred, knowing that Yeyosh will ultimately occur? So this is machlokes Abaye and Rava. Abaye says Yeyosh Shalomidas is not Yeyosh, and therefore I do not have the ability to keep the object. Rava says it is Yeyosh. So the Gemara is bringing up a series of cases trying to bolster one opinion and contradict another opinion. It says Gemara Tashma, most mefuzars ha'elu shalom. Mishnah said that if you find scattered money, right? I'm walking down the Shtarabim and I find scattered money, I am permitted to go ahead and keep that money. So the Gemara says, Amai, I don't understand why is that permitted. I don't know the Pashkas, the owner doesn't know that he lost it. So this is the case of Yesh Shalomidas. So which the Gemara says, no, the Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Yitzchak. What does Rabbi Yitzchak say? The Amar Adam Asoy Lemashmish Bekiso Bechol Shah V'Shah. So Rabbi Yitzchak says that it is common for a person to always touch their wallet. Right? A person is always aware of his money, and therefore, the moment that a person loses the money, he is aware of it. So this is not a case of Yesh Shalomidas. This is a case of Das. Okay? So where it says Tashma Igulei Dvela. Mishnah said that if you're walking through Rosh Hashanah and I find cakes of pressed figs, or loaves, right? Baker's loaves. So these are cases where I am permitted to go ahead and keep the objects. Permitted to keep the objects. The Gemara says, Amai, how am I allowed to keep it? After all, V'halo yada denafal minei. But one second, but Bepashtos, the owner of the object, is not aware that he lost them. So isn't this a case of Yeyosh Shalomidas? And yet the fact that I'm allowed to keep it would seem to indicate that halacha l'maisa, we passed like Abaye, that Yeyosh Shalomidas is Yeyosh. To which the Gemara says, no, Hasam Nami, Agav Diyakri Meidi Yodabu. Since these items are heavy, people are aware, ultimately, again, if they dropped them or not. Okay? Tashma, L'shana Shal Argaman. So literally, again, tufts tufts of purple wool. Hare Elu Shalom. If I'm walking Rosh Hashanah and I find them, I'm allowed to keep them. Va'amai, Halo Yada Denafal Minei. But one second, the owner is unaware that he lost the object. To which the Gemara says, Hasanami agav dechashivi mishmushe memashmesh behukid Rabbi Yitzchak. Since this is expensive, people are always checking for it. So therefore, I will say essentially what the Gemara is asking, or the Gemara is answering, is these are not cases of Yesh Shalomidas, because the person, as soon as he's aware of it, is acutely aware of the loss. Therefore, there's instantaneous Yeyosh, and therefore, by the time I find it, it's already ownerless, and I'm allowed to go ahead and keep it. Good. So the Gemara says, Tashma. Hamotzi Mosavati Kinesios Avati Midrashos, Ubechom Makom Sharab Yitsuim Sham, Hare Elu Shalom, Mipnei Shabai Metzia Shemei. So we'll say actually interesting halacha. If you find money in the shul, or you find money in the base medrash, So what's the halacha? You're allowed to keep it. You're allowed to keep it. Why? Because b'pashtos, a shul, a beis medrash, is a public place, and therefore the owner gives up hope of really ever retrieving the money. By the way, that is not the halacha here, right? The halacha here is if you lose money, it's going to the building fund. So just to be clear, But again, so I will say, so the idea over here is that once again, this seems to be a case of yeyosh shalomidas, and yet you see that yeyosh shalomidas is yeyosh, like Rava, not like Abaye, to which the Gemara says, I have a halo yoda denafal mine, but bepashtos, the person doesn't know that he lost the money. Rabbi Yitzchak, Adam asur lamash meish bekisa b'chol shah. So we keep on seeing this opinion of Rabbi Yitzchak, that it is common for a person to kind of, pat his pocket. It's common for a person to kind of just want to be constantly aware of his money. And therefore, again, bepashtos, when he loses the money, he's instantly aware of what's occurred, has experienced the yeyosh, and therefore when I find it, I'm permitted to keep it. Incredible. Tashma, me'masai ka'odam mutarim b'leket mileket. It was actually interesting halacha. So we know the halacha of leket, right? Leket shichacha peya. So these are all agricultural tithes or agricultural portions that one is obligated to go ahead and leave for the poor, right? So remember again, so leket is that halacha l'maisa, I'm going ahead and I'm harvesting my field. I left some stuff behind. I have to go ahead and leave that. I have to leave that ultimately for the poor. So the Gemara says, here's what's interesting. At what point in time do we assume that any leket left over in the field is totally hefker? It's totally hefker. So the Gemara says, when is that? It's interesting. Mishiyilchu bo hanamushos. After the namushos walk through the field. I asks the Gemara, my nemushos, what's nemushos? Rabbi Yochanan, sabi da azli atigra. It's the old people who walk with canes, who walk with sticks. Reish Lakish amar likute, basra likute. It's the collectors who come after the collectors. Rabbi said the idea being over here is that the final stage, after you leave tithes to the poor. So when the old people, according to the first one, when the old people come along, they walk very slowly. So because they walk very slowly, whatever is of value, they're going to collect. Or according to Reish Lakish, this likute basar likute. This is like the final stage collectors. So whatever is of value, they're going to take. And after this chevra passes through, whatever is left there. Why? It's left there. Why? Because no one wants it. Even the aniyim don't want it. So at that point in time, whatever is left becomes fundamentally hefker. The Gemara says, va'amai, nihi aniyim dahacha miyashi, ika aniyim beduchta achrisa delo miyashi. I don't understand. See, even though now at this point in time, maybe the local aniyim, maybe they have yeyosh, but what about aniyim from a different time? Because remember again, I both say, leket, shichacha, peya, these are all open to any aniyim, not just to the regional aniyim. So why don't we say that again? Aniyim from another town, they might choose to come. To which the Gemara says, Amri kevan di'ika aniyim hacha, hanach me'ikar eyushim yayish, ve'amri aniyim dahasam melaktile. This is actually very interesting. The Gemara says, in general, the way it works is that aniyim understand that the local aniyim are always going to be the ones who go ahead and collect from the tithes of the poor, right? So l'maisa, they already have yeyosh, right? The out-of-town aniyim already have yeyosh ultimately again on everything that's not in their domain. Okay. I'm sorry? Okay, Chavra. Apparently this is the 32nd warning for the beginning of the fast. All right, enjoy, and remember a bracha achrona. So the Gemara says as follows. So Tashma, kitzios b'derech v'afilu b'tzad sadek kitzios. You must listen to this. Let's say you find dried figs. Kitzios are dried figs. You find dried figs on the derech, on the road. Even if you find the dried figs right next to a field where they're dafka drying figs, right? Oh, is that? That's the. Seeing business. Yeah. Fast alarm, right? No, which means business. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, Te'ena hanotel derech umatza te'ena tachta. Or you have a fig tree a fig tree that overhangs the Rosh Hashanah, that overhangs the road, and you find figs underneath it. So what's the halacha? Mutaros mishum gezal. So ultimately, again, if you come upon these fruits, right? You come upon the dried figs, the regular figs. Ultimately, again, there's no theft. No theft means you're allowed to take it, which means that it's hefker. Upturos min meiser, and ultimately, again, it is not subject to any type of meiser obligation, which also indicates that it's ownerless. However, again, when it comes to olives or it comes to carobs, aser. It's aser. So what's going on over here? Says Rabbi Shmuel Silber. So first case, according to Abai, is not a question. Why? Agov de chashivi memashmish behu. Since ultimately, again, this is a chashav item, a person is constantly aware of it. Te'ina nami, when it comes to the case of the fig, so meida yada dinatra. It's common. People know that it's going to fall off the tree. Ela seifa l'rava kasha, but what does Rava do with the seifa? So the Gemara says, Diktani b'zeisim mecharuvim aser. On Rabbi Avo, shiny zayis is interesting. An olive is different. Why is an olive different? Hoil v'chazuso mochiach alav. Shabbos said, this is fascinating. Who knew? Apparently, not all olives look the same. And apparently, again, I guess if you're holding in olives, so olives that come from a particular place, I don't know what is olives comes from, an orchard, okay, an olive grove, right? So olives, you're able to identify which olives came from which field. And even though the olives fall off the tree, people know which olives came from which person's field. Incredible. Duchta de inish inishu. A person's place is his place. If that's the case, what about the Reisha? Switch the Gemara to Amra Papa. Te'ina nifilasem nemeses. A fig is different. Right? A fig is different. Why is a fig different? Because once a fig falls off the tree, it becomes disgusting. Right? Once it gets on the ground, it becomes disgusting. So therefore, by definition, it's going to be yeyosh with that. All right. Tashma. Interesting case, I will say. Haganav shenatal mizev nasal lazeh. A thief steals from Reuven and gives to Shimon. V'chein. Gazlon shenatal mizev nasal lazeh. Or a gazlon. I must remember again. Difference between a ganov and a gazlon, right? So a ganov steals secretly, surreptitiously. A gazlon steals in an outright fashion. So in both of these cases, you have a ganov or a gazlon who stole from Reuven and gave to Shimon. What's the halacha? Top of Chav base 22a. V'chein yardein shenatal mizev nasal lazeh. Or I will say, imagine for a moment the Jordan River, right? The river took from this one and gave to that one, which means that the river, right, washed away the property of Reuven and ultimately again deposited it in Shimon's field. Masha natal natal umasha nasan nasan. Shabbos said this is interesting. What's been taken has been taken, and what's been given is what's been given. Shabbos says, so bepashtos, what this means is that what? That the second party acquires the object. Second party acquires the object. I says, okay, let's analyze this a little bit. Bishlama gazlon v'yardin tekachazi lehu umiyayish. So I understand the case of gazlon and in the case of and the case of the river. Why? Because we'll say in these cases, Reuven is seeing that what? Armed robbers are stealing an object from him. Reuven is seeing that the river is washing it away from him. So he sees it, he knows he's not getting it back. He has yesh. Once he has yesh, what's the status of the item? What's the status of the item? Hefker. So therefore, once it reaches Shimon's hands, it makes sense that Shimon acquires the object because Shimon has acquired an object from Hefker. Elaganov, Mika Chazile Demiyash. But in the case of Ganav, Rabosai, the case of Ganav, so somebody is secretly, right, or surreptitiously breaking into Reuven's house, stealing an object. Reuven doesn't even know about it. So if Reuven doesn't know about it, therefore what? This is Yesh Shalamidas. If it's Yesh Shalamidas, then still when it gets to Shimon's hands, Reuven doesn't know about it yet. So how could Shimon acquire it? They're both saying now the fact that the Brisa says that Shimon acquires it indicates to us that what? That Yesh Shalomidas Havi Yesh. Is Yesh bolstering the position of Rava, contradicting Abaye, to which the Gemara says, no, Tergam Rapapa, Belistim Mizuyin. No, Rapapa says, what's the case? They both say, what's the case of Ganav? The case of Ganav ultimately is a case of armed robbers. To which the Gemara says, Listim Mizuyin Ihachi, Hainu Gazlon. So I say that's not Ganav. That's not Ganav. That's Gazlan. The Gemara says you're right. Trey Gavni Gazlan. You're right. We're actually not talking about a case of Geneva. We're talking about a case of Gezela. And there are two different cases of Gazlan. One is, I guess, a good old Gazlan who just goes ahead and, threatens you or just, punches you, uses his fist. And then there's armed robbers. Two different cases of Gazlan. Okay, but in Achinami, the Brayse says not talking about a case of Ganav. In other words, essentially what the Gemara is answering is, it's not a case of Yesh Shalom Midas. That's the bottom line answer. Tashma, let's go weiter. Again, I will say, these cases are exciting because it's just like rapid fire cases trying to either question Abaye or Rava. So it says the Gemara, Tashma, Shataf nar korav eitzav va'avanov v'nasna b'soch salei chaverov. So we'll say, watch this case. The river overflows my field. And what does it do? It washes away my property, right? My beams or my stones, and deposits it in Reuven's field. So what's halacha? Reuven becomes the owner of these objects. Why? Because I have experienced Yeush. Okay? To which the Gemara says, Hastama lo. What do you see from here? I'm sorry, Taima didn't say Aishu Abaylim. Hastama lo. They will say, why does Reuven become the owner of the object? Why? Because I experienced Yeush. So what do you see from here? Had I not experienced Yeush, right, then ultimately again, Reuven wouldn't acquire it. What do you see from here? That Yeush Shalom Midas is not Yeush. To which the Gemara says, so it says, interesting. What's the case over here? The case over here is that as the river was washing away the objects, I had the ability, had I chosen to do so, to rescue my property. So the Gemara says, okay. So we'll say, so bepashtos, if I have the ability to go ahead and do it, and I don't do it, then suddenly again, this is a case of what? This is a case of actual Yeush. To which the Gemara says, well, okay, let's analyze this. Ihaki ema seifa, but then look at the end of the brayso. Im hayu abayle mirat finacharehem chayiv lahachzir. If so, at the end of the brayso says, if I was running after my property as it was being washed away, then ultimately again, Reuven, who finds it afterwards or whose property it's deposited in, is obligated to return it. The Gemara says, okay, but if it's a case where I'm able to save my property, my area miratvin. What does it matter if I'm running after it? Afilu in miratvin. Even if I'm unable to go, even if I don't run after it, so the Gemara says, afilu in miratvin, afilu in miratvin nami. Right? Even if I'm not running after it, again, he should still be obligated to go ahead and return it. Why? Because since I know that I have the ability ultimately, again, to get back my property, I'm not miyayish. What's the case? Interesting case over here. So we'll say it's a case where I could save my property, but it's not easy to save it. In other words, I could save it, but it would require a significant amount of effort. So therefore, miratfin lo yayish, if I'm running after my property, that's clear that I'm not miyayish. Ein miratfin, but if I don't go and run after it, Iyushe miyayish. It is clear that I'm experiencing Yeush. Okay? So Gemara goes weiter. Tashma, Keitzer Amru HaTorim Shalom Idaito Truma So Truma. So it's an interesting case over here. Right? This is an interesting case. I go into Reuven's field and I tithe. I take Truma from Reuven's produce. So in other words, I'm not a Kohen. It's not like I'm seizing anything for myself. But I'm going into Reuven's field and I'm separating out Truma from Reuven's property without Reuven's knowledge. So says the Gemara, what's the case of Hatorim Shalom Midas that the Truma is good? What's the case of when you tithe someone's property without their knowledge that the separation is still valid? Watch this. I go into Reuven's property and I tithe his property without his rishos. Im choshesh mishum gezel ein truma sa truma. If there's a concern that Reuven's going to look at me as a thief, right, as a thief, inappropriately dealing with his property, then the designation is not valid. Vim lav truma sa truma. But if he doesn't look at me as a thief, then ultimately the designation will be valid. So the Gemara says, okay, uminayin hu yadim choshesh mishum gezel vim lav. So it says, how do I know? Right? So here again, just to be clear, I'm trying to do the right, not the right thing. I'm trying to do something nice. I think, what, Reuven works so hard, he's so busy. Let me just go into his field and separate out as truma for him. So the Kashaila is, does a designation work? So the Gemara says, it depends. Does Reuven look at me as a thief or not? If he looks at me as a thief, then ultimately, again, designation is not good. If he doesn't look at me as a thief, then the designation is good. How do I know how Reuven looks at me? How do I know? To which the Gemara says, watch this. Harsheba balabayis umaza. Well, say here's how Reuven comes into the field and he finds me separating out the truma from his property. And remember again, he didn't ask me to do anything. V'amar lo, and Reuven says to me, Kelecha etzel yafos, why didn't you separate out nicer produce? He says to me, you should have separated out even nicer produce for truma. So Rabbi says, this is interesting. So how do we interpret that statement? So the Gemara says, it depends. Em mimtzu yafos mehen truma sa truma. So Rabbi says, if it turns out that Reuven in fact does have nicer produce than the stuff I separated, then that's indicative of the fact that he's happy with what I did. He appreciates what I did, and he's saying I could have even done more. The imlav, I will say, however, what happens if it turns out that Reuven doesn't have nicer produce? Then what? Ein truma sa truma. Then my designation is not a valid one. Why not? How do we view his statement? As a sarcastic and cynical one. Essentially what he's saying is, make yourself at home. Why pour yourself a cup of coffee? Why don't you take my nicer produce? So again, it's interesting, I will say, how the same statement, right? So Reuven comes into the field, sees me separating truma on his behalf without being asked to do so. He says, you should have used nicer produce. If he has nicer produce, that's indicative that he's happy with what I did. If he doesn't have nicer produce, that's indicative that he is unhappy with what I did and kind of voicing his displeasure in a shtickle, passive, aggressive, cynical, sarcastic fashion. So the Gemara says, "Liktu habaylim v'osifu aleim." We'll say, what happens if I designated truma on Reuven's behalf without his knowledge? Then he comes to the field and he adds on. So ben kach truma sa truma. So we'll say, so then in that case, where clearly what he's doing is he's adding on to my designation that clearly indicates that he's happy with what I did and the designation is good. Says the Gemara, I don't understand. So we'll say, so even in the case, right, where Reuven walks into the field and he says, you should have separated out nicer produce. And there is nicer produce. I don't understand, why is it that the designation is good? After all, but inna the taram halo yada. So I'll say Reuven had no idea what I was doing at the time that I did it. So b'pashtos, how should it work? In other words, at the end of the day, it's very nice that Reuven comes after the fact and says that lamaisa, you should have done even nicer produce, and he has nicer produce, so that shows that he wants it. But lamaisa, at the time that I was separating it, Reuven was not knowledgeable of what I was doing. So because he was not knowledgeable at the time that I was doing it, how does it work at all? So we'll say, so remember again, essentially what the Gemara is saying over here is, what do you see from here? That even if someone doesn't know what you're doing at the time that you're doing it, later on when they become knowledgeable, if they're happy with what occurred, then retroactively the maisa is good. Which would also, if we loop this back, seem to indicate to us what? Yeyosh shalomidas havi yeyosh. Since the person ultimately, again, when he finds out, when he realizes that he lost the object, he's going to have yeyosh. So therefore, again, almost like retroactively, we say that the yeyosh takes effect as of now. Okay, to which the Gemara says, this is not a good proof, I'll tell you why. Different case I was saying. The case over here is, Reuven appointed me as an agent. So when I'm separating out Truma, I'm actually doing it as a form of agency. The Gemara says it has to be this way. It has to be this way. Why? Because if it's a case where Reuven did not establish me as a shaliach, I will say, if I am not acting as Reuven's shaliach, then my designation will be halachically irrelevant. Why? So the Gemara says, "V'ha atem gam atem amarachmana l'rabos shluchachem." Shabbos said, because the pasuk ultimately again by Truma says, "Kain tarimu gam atem." So this is how you shall separate it. Also you gam atem. Shabbos say gam atem comes to include that what? Not only does the owner of the produce have the ability to separate out Truma, but even who? Even an agent, even a shliach. But I will say, but watch this. So the Gemara says, Gam atem amru Rachmana, l'rabos shluchachem, ma atem l'daitchem. So I'll say, just like when a person separates out his own truma, he does it with das. Av shluchachem l'datchem. So too your shaliach has to operate with your das as well. So for the Gemara says, no, you got the case all wrong over here. I'm not entering into Reuven's field just of my own volition, separating out, in an unauthorized capacity. Reuven authorized me as his shaliach. That's what's happening over here. The Gemara says, okay, I understand. So if he's authorizing me as a shaliach, so then what's the problem? Well, I don't understand what the case is. So Ela Hacham asking, what's the case? Kigon, the shavi shaliach, va'amar le zil trom, v'lo amar le zil trom mehani. Watch this, Rabbi Say. So what's unique about this case? This is actually quite fascinating. What's unique about this case is the following. Reuven appointed me as a shaliach to separate out truma. Right? So Reuven says, Silber, so take truma from my produce. What doesn't Reuven tell me? What doesn't he tell me? What type of produce to utilize? So therefore the Gemara says, Ustami de balabayis, kitara mibeinu nesutarim. Rabbi say, stam balabas, when he separates out truma, what kind of produce does he separate from? Beinonis, right? Medium grade produce. And what happens? So the Gemara says, "Va'azal ihu v'tar miyafos." I, the shaliach, so again, I'm empowered to be there, but he didn't give me any guidance about what kind of produce to use for truma, to separate out for truma. So stam balabas wants to use beinonis. I decided of my own volition to what? To separate out, right? Idis. The nicest produce for truma. So we'll say, so now what's the shaila? The shaila is, does my designation work? So now this whole thing makes more sense. Uba balabayis umatzo. So the balabayis now, right? Reuven comes home and he sees what I did. And what is Reuven's response? Va'amar kelecha itzel yafos. And Reuven says, you should have used even nicer produce. So how do we interpret Reuven's statement? Imnim to yafos mehen truma. So truma will say first white line in the bottom. Say if Reuven indeed has nicer produce, then that's clear that Reuven's happy with my designation, and we're good to go. Ve'imlav, but if he doesn't have nicer produce, then we interpret that statement, his statement, as being one of sarcasm and cynicism, and therefore my designation is not good because it's clear that he only wanted to use beinonis. Incredible. Gemara tells a story about, say, along these same lines. Amaymar umar zutra v'Rabashi iklu lebustana demari bar isik. So Amaymar marzutra Ravashi went to the orchard. Rashi says a pardes. On an orchard of Mari Bar Isik. Okay. I see Arise Tamri Verimoni Vishada Kamayu. So the sharecropper of Mari Bar Isik, right? Mari Bar Isik apparently wasn't home or wasn't there. So the sharecropper brought before these Rabbanim dates, pomegranates. Amema Ravashi Achli. Amema Ravashi ate of the produce. Marzutra lo achol. Marzutra didn't eat. Now, why was Marzutra not eating? Marzutra was concerned that it was theft. Marzutra was concerned that who says the sharecropper has the right to go ahead and give of the fruit to guests. So Marzutra felt, therefore, again, he didn't want to partake. While all this was going on, Asi Mari Bar Isik. So Mari Bar Isik, the owner of the field, came along. Ashkechinu, v'amrei la'arise, amaylo I say le'il rabbana mehanach shapirta. So we'll say, what happened? Mari Bar Isik, the owner of the pardes, owner of the orchard, said to a sharecropper, why didn't you give my distinguished guests even from better produce? So apparently, Ameimar and Ravashi continued to eat. Marzutra still didn't eat. They turned to Marzutra, they said, Marzutra, what's the matter with you? Right? Mari Bar Isik, the owner, is back now, and you see clearly he just said to the sharecropper, you should have given my guests even nicer produce, which means what? He's more than happy for us to eat of the produce of the field. Tanya, imnimsu yafos men trumasa truma. Amar lahu. So we'll say, watch this. So they brought the proof from the Truma case, right? That if the owner comes, right, if Reuven comes back to the field and he sees that I separated out Truma, and he says that what? You should have separated out even nicer produce, and there is nicer produce, that's indicative that he's good with what I did. So too over here, when Mari Bar Isik comes back and he says to the sharecropper, you should have given them even nicer produce, but Pashas, assuming there was nicer produce, you see that Mari Bar Isik is happy to have us eating his produce. So Marzutra, you have something to eat. So Amar Lehach Yomarava, Lo Amru Kelecha Eitzel Yafos Elo Le'inyan Truma Bilvad mishum de mitzvah hu v'nechalei. So Mar Zutra said, guys, you're mixing apples and oranges, so to speak, or whatever, dates and pomegranates, right? Lemaisa, that concept that when Reuven comes back and he says, you should have separated out even nicer, that's by truma. That's by a mitzvah. Because by a mitzvah, we could see that a person might want to go above and beyond. Aval hacha mishum kesifuso hu da amar hachi. I will say what Mar Zutra was concerned about is that when Mari Bar Isik came home and he found that these Rabbanim were at his house eating his stuff, he would have been embarrassed. In other words, he says to the sharecropper, "Oh, you should have given them nicer produce." Why? Because he was embarrassed. In other words, what is he going to say? It could be that of his own volition he wouldn't have offered any fruit, right? Or he didn't authorize any fruit to be offered. But now they're already eating. He's already the host. He might have felt compelled to say, "Oh, you should have given them nicer stuff," because again, he would have felt embarrassed had he not offered more. But maybe it was not a wholehearted offering. Okay, therefore, Mar Zutra chose to go ahead and not partake. I'll say it's a very it's a fascinating yesod how in life you do have to be careful about putting people in a situation where they have no choice but to say yes. Right? Because sometimes people feel compelled, they don't want to look miserly, or they don't want to look, just ungenerous. You have to be careful about putting people in situations where halacha l'maaseh they may feel compelled to give, even if they are themselves talking about, even though, again, it doesn't apply to tzedakah. Tzedakah is a different kind of situation, right? But l'maaseh just in life, about putting people in situations where they may feel compelled they have to do something and they don't really want to do it. Okay, let's go right there. Says the Imar Tashma, Odeo atal alein, v'sama chareze b'chiyutan. So we'll say, we've actually seen this halacha before, so very quickly, the halacha is like this. Produce only becomes susceptible to tumah when it comes in contact with one of the 7 liquids. So we'll say, so now interestingly enough, the halacha is like this. Obviously, if you intentionally wet something, so then of course it is going to be receptive to tumah. The case of the Rabbi say is like this. Let's say again, my produce is out in the fields. Let's say I have just a simple case. I have apples, right, spread out. And what happens now? It rains, and I see that my produce is wet, and I'm happy. I'm happy that the produce is wet. In other words, I'm happy that it became wet. So what's the halacha? Hareze b'chiyutan. Then ultimately, we'll say b'chiyutan means that now it's receptive to tumah. So again, in other words, the obvious case is if I actively wet my produce, right? If I actively cause my produce to become wet, then obviously it becomes receptive to tumah. The case you're talking about over here is my produce became wet. It rained. And now I realize that the produce is wet, and I'm happy that it's wet. Now it's receptive to tumah. Okay. The Gemara says, Nikvu, however, let's say my produce became wet, then it dried. And I only found out that it became wet after it dried. Even though I'm happy that it became wet, it is not receptive to tumah. Why? Why not? Because I will say my awareness only occurred when? After the produce was already dried. So the Gemara says, "Time amai, why exists? Lag mishum delo amrinan kevan diglai milsa dahashta nechal meikar." Now let's say, why is that? Because what do you see from here? What you see from here is that we don't say that if you find something out now, then your current das applies retroactively. That's what it means. So we'll say, why is the Gemara bringing this up? Because the Gemara wants to bring this as a proof that yeyosh shalomi das lo havi yeyosh. That even when a person finds out that they lost something, right, and now that they're miyayish, we don't apply that yeyosh mindset retroactively. In the same way that if I find out that my produce was wet, now it's dry, but I'm happy that it was wet, that doesn't make the produce susceptible to tumah. Okay? Says the Marshani Hasam D'chsiv ki yitain. We'll say tumah is different. This case is different. Why? Because the lashon by tumah is ki yitain. When a person will place the liquid on his produce. Ad sheyitei. You see from here that produce only becomes susceptible to tumah if you actively put the liquid on the produce. Ilana says, 1 second. But that's not true. We just saw before that if it rains, right? Let's say if it rains and the produce becomes wet, and now the produce is still wet, and you're happy that it's wet, it's susceptible to tumah. So you see from here that what? you don't have to actively put the moisture on the produce for it to become susceptible to tumah. Gemara says, no. Hasam k'dirah papa. Dirah papa rami ksiv. The Papa contrasted two psukim. On one hand, the pasuk says ki yitain, the karinon ki yutan. So I will say the pasuk says ki yitain. Now, what does ki yitain mean? Ki yitain means a person places one of the 7 liquids on the produce. But we read it yutan. Yutan means what? Liquid will be placed on the produce. In other words, we'll say, so I'm not doing it myself, it's happening. So how do you reconcile this? Okay, so which one is it? Which one is it? We'll say, do one of the 7 liquids have to actively be placed on the produce? Or is it enough if the produce becomes wet? And again, I'm just happy with the fact that it became wet. Okay, so the Gemara says, Ba'inon ki yutan dumya dechi yitain. You need yutan that's like yitain. How so? Ma yitain ladas af ki yutan nami ladas. I will say, just like yitain means it's happening with my das, so to the yutan. So in other words, I will say, bottom line, by moisture and tumah, I don't have to place the moisture on. I don't have to place the liquid on the produce for it to become susceptible to tumah. But what does have to happen? I have to be acutely aware and desirous of the produce becoming wet while it's still wet. But if I only find out that the produce became wet after it was dried, even though I was happy that it became wet, it's not susceptible to tumah. So we'll say, so bottom line, the Gemara just says, you can't bring this up over here because this is a separate halacha. Okay, tashma. So we'll say again, we're still in our machlokes Abai and Rava. Still in our machlokes. So tashma. Then Rabbi Shmuel ben Yosef, minayin la'aveda sheshatfa nar shimuteres. So we'll say, how do we know that ultimately, again, if I have an object, and the object was washed away by the river, that it is mutter. And we'll say, now, what does it mean that it's mutter? That if someone else finds it, they're allowed to keep it, right? Essentially, because when the river washes it away, I have yeosh. Once I have yeosh, it becomes hefker. When someone else finds it, they're allowed to keep it. To which the Gemara says, Dichsiv, v'chein sasa l'chamoro, v'chein sasa l'simloso, v'chein sasa l'chola v'das achicha. So we'll say, this is the pasuk of Hashavas Aveda, returning lost objects. So if you find your friend's lost object, this is what you should do for his donkey, this is what you should do for his clothing, and this is what you should do for everything that your brother loses. Asher tovad mimenu umitzasa. Something that it was lost to your brother, and you found it. So this is actually fascinating. Gemara says, Mi sha'avuda himenu umitzuya eitzel kol adam. So we'll say, the mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda applies to what? Something that is lost to the owner, but actively found and available to everyone else. So I'll say that's the mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda, right? So the owner right now doesn't have it, but it's easily accessible to everyone else. Yasa sazu, what does it come to exclude? Sha'avuda mimenu ve'ena matsuya eitzel kol adam. So I'll say, what does it come to exclude? It comes to exclude a case of an object that is lost to the owner, but is not easily accessible to everyone else. So I'll say, what's a good example of that? What's a good example of that? The river washing away an object. So when the river washes away my property, so we'll say it's avuda, it's lost to me. Is it accessible to everyone else? No, it's in the river. Who knows where the river is going to deposit it? So we'll say, so because it's actually interesting. The paradigm, well, we're going to talk much more about this, but the paradigm of Hashavas Aveda, returning a lost object, is it is lost to the owner, but available to everyone else. Therefore, again, I will say, in this case, where the river washes away the object, it is lost to the owner, but not available to everyone else, and therefore there is no mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda, i.e. the item is hefker, and whoever finds it is permitted to go ahead and keep it. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. So the Isura Dumya Dehatera. And ultimately, actually we do understand. And ultimately, again, the case of Isser, ultimately, again, is comparable to Heter. In other words, we'll say, which means, look at Rashi. Rashi is the first short line. The Isura Dumya Dehatera, Kevan de Mechad Krayafina Mitsuya Eitzel Ka'adam, Sheyachsir, V'She'ina Mitsuya Yiskeba, is kushe iskish lahada di zuli sur v'zulatera. So we'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that the Torah itself compares a case of a situation where I am prohibited to keep something versus when I am permitted to keep something. That's what it means when it says isser and heter. Isser means I can't keep it. Heter means I can keep it. Mahatera, Bein de ispe simin ben de leslei simin. So we'll say, so just like again in the case of heter, whether the object has a simin or doesn't have a simin, it doesn't matter. Shara, I'm permitted to keep it. Afi surah, so to in a case when I can't keep it. Bein de ispe simin, bein de lespe simin isura. So we'll say, so again, either way, I'm not permitted to go ahead and keep it. To which the Gemara says, Tiyufta derava. So we'll say, what do you see from here? Look, first of all, look at Rashi. Afi surah, the Metzia eitzel kol adam. So we'll say, so remember again, the case of heter is going to be the case of where the object is lost to the owner and not accessible to everyone else. That's the case of heter. So therefore, heter means there's no mitzvah hashavas haveda. The object is effectively hefker. Wherever someone finds it, they're permitted to keep it. The case of isura is where ultimately, again, it's not accessible to the owner, is accessible to everyone else, and therefore I can't keep it. I have to return it. So the Gemara says like this, interesting on both sides. Just like in the case of, so we compare the case of Esther and heter. Look at Rashi. Afi surah, the Metzia eitzel kol adam. So we'll say, so isura is the case of where it's not accessible to the owner, but it is accessible to everyone else. Therefore, there's a mitzvah hashavas haveda. Lo chilik bein im simin dechiyada miyayishlei. I'm sorry. Bein ein simin. So there makes no distinction whether the object has a simin or doesn't have a simin. Because we also remember again, if the object doesn't have a simin, then bepashtos the owner is miyayish. Dechiyada miyayish liyesh simin dechiyada lo miyayish. Dechihechi diyesh simin asira ki ein simin nami asira. So we'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, when ultimately, again, a person loses an object, and the object is not accessible to the owner, is accessible to everyone else, it makes no difference if the object has a simin or doesn't have a simin. One is obligated to try to go ahead and get it back to the owner. Even though what? It's the type of situation where when the owner becomes aware of what it is that he lost, he is going to be miyayish. So what do you see from here? You see from here that yeyosh shalom midas is not yeyosh. Is not yeyosh. To which the Gemara says, tiyufta derava tiyufta. This effectively refutes the position of Rava, and indeed it is an effective refutation. So I said the Gemara essentially just went ahead and refuted the position of Rava, and which means paskening like Abaye, that yeyosh shalom midas lo have yeyosh. Which means Rabbi say that halacha l'maisa, when Reuven loses an object and is unaware that he lost the object, even though when he does become aware, he is going to have yeyosh. He's going to have yeyosh. Nevertheless, right now, because I found it before he had yeyosh, therefore halacha l'maisa, I am not permitted to go ahead and keep the object. To which the Gemara says, and ultimately, again, the Gemara says that halacha l'maisa, halacha follows Abaye Yaakov. So we'll say these are the 6 cases that the halacha follows Abaye over Rava. And again, interestingly enough, the first of the 6 cases, Ya'al Yud, is yeyosh shalom midas. So I will say, so beautifully, the Gemara has reached a conclusion that halacha l'maisa, we ask him, like Abaye, yeyosh shalom midas, lo havi yeyosh. So again, halacha l'maisa, when the owner loses an object, he's unaware that he lost it. Even though when he does become aware, he will have yeyosh. Right now, we do not view him as having had yeyosh, and therefore, whoever finds it, ultimately, again, is not permitted to keep it. Incredible. Good. We'll say, let's go right for just another minute. So we'll say, now that we've effectively refuted the position of Rava, Hani Tamri Dezeka, so we'll say, so what do you do ultimately again? Tamri Dezeka means the dates that are blown off the tree by the wind. By the wind. Rashi says, Sharuach Meisher, how are you allowed to eat it? After all, again, I will say, isn't that a case of yesh shalom midas? Yesh shalom midas. To which the Gemara says, Amar lehu kevan de'ika shkatzim v'ramasim deka'achli lehu meikara yeushe miyayish minayu. So we'll say, it's different over there. Why is it different over there? Because everyone knows that when dates fall on the ground, right, the shkatzim v'ramasim, it's disgusting. It's going to get gross. So because of that, an owner understands from the beginning that halacha l'maisa, anything that falls on the ground, ultimately, again, is going to be miyayish, and therefore, essentially, It's not a case of yesh shlomidas. Right, so we'll stop over here for today. Tremendous. We got resolution in the machlokas Abai and Rava. Yal kigam yesh shlomidas lo havi yesh. Shkoyach Chavra.